Next, we can look at how this definition works in something I'm calling the information engineered classroom. Now, this is a secondary school in China where young students, you can see, are harnessed to a headband, which apparently is lifting electromagnetic brain waves from their scalp and converting those brain waves into some kind of score, which measures how well the students are, um, how much the students are paying attention to their task, or how on focus they are, or how on task they are. Now, let's leave aside questions about, for the moment, questions about whether these tools actually work, actually tell us anything. I'm not sure they do, but just assuming that they do. Assuming that these tools do, in fact, reveal something about whether or not the students are paying attention in class, whether or not they are learning at that moment, what kinds of ethical questions or discussions arise. So I think that we can kind of take this perhaps from the teacher's perspective and think about this screen that she has where she sees a report about each student in real time that's depicting or documenting how well that student is paying attention to his or her lesson. We could imagine in the future, the student it may even record whether or not the student is feeling challenged by the lesson, whether or not the student needs help from the teacher, or the student is doing just fine independently. Again, for the ethical conversation, we don't need to worry right now about the technical reality of these things. What we're trying to do is understand what these um, emotion AI technologies that understand how humans are acting from biometric kinds of data, how these emotion AI technologies can be understood in ethical terms. Right? That's the goal. And so, why don't we just consider a few human values? The idea of autonomy or freedom. You could think from the point of view of the students. You might ask, well, I mean, do these headsets increase their personal freedom? Do they increase their autonomy? Autonomy presumably is something worth having. We all want to be free, not because we want to be free for some other reason, though perhaps we also want to be free to be happy. But most of us want to be free just in and of itself. We don't want to be slaves. We don't want to be told what to do. We want to make our own decisions about our own lives. So if that's a human value, if that's something worth having, then does this tool aid that value? In some ways, yes. Right. On the one hand, you might say, look, what one thing this tool does is help students learn better. And if that's true, well, then it follows that they're going to have more possibilities in the future. A better education typically translates into more opportunities and therefore more freedom, more choices. You have a broader horizon of possibilities in front of you. So you could say on one side, within this ethical process of evaluation, sure, human freedom is increased by these tools. But on the other hand, when you see the tools and you know the teacher is watching you every moment on this screen, it seems like you could also make the contrary argument. And you could say that there is a kind of bondage. It's almost a kind of electronic slavery to this headband, that it is reducing your freedom, reducing the kinds of things you can do, at least at that moment in the classroom. And then that might open a different kind of discussion, ethical discussion, about the difference between the sort of freedom, the process freedom or operational freedom that one feels in any particular moment. And on that level, it seems like this tool would challenge freedom, right? Because you feel as though you're being observed by the teacher, you're being constrained by the teacher, you're being forced to do your work. So it seems like operationally, your freedom is being limited. But then we said it's also true that in the long term it might increase. So there might be a sort of a structural increase in human freedom or autonomy. Now, there's a lot more to say about that, but for this part of our discussion, the only thing that matters is that we're talking about and doing ethics. And if we're talking about and discussing something, autonomy or human freedom, that's worth having on its own. And that kind of discussion is completely different from other discussions you might have about this classroom, about whether or not it's legal to be prying into human minds like that, about whether or not it is cost effective. I mean, it probably is quite expensive to mount this classroom. So if we're an economist here. The economist might say, wait a minute now, we might get a tiny improvement in teaching or in educational results, but the expense of all this technology is quite high. It would be less expensive and we would get better results if we just hired another teacher. Right? That's the kind of thing an economist would say. And a perfectly valid thing to say. It is not ethics. It has nothing to do with ethics. And continuing on that line, right, someone who is interested in technology, they might very well ask, well, how do these tools work? What exactly do they absorb from the brain? How do they transmit those results? How do they process those results? What does artificial intelligence or digital information engineering mean in this specific case? Those are very interesting questions, important questions, but they're not ethics questions. Ethics asks, do these things make the students more free or less free? Or we could ask similarly about privacy. Do these tools subtract from student privacy? Certainly, it seems like in some ways they do. They're grabbing information from the student, and the student has no control over that, right? I mean, the student just is a passive observer while the brain electromagnetic waves are transported to the teacher's screen. So it does seem like there's some privacy questions you could ask here. You might also ask about fairness. Um, does this machine work equally well for every student? And what happens if a grade is attributed to students based upon how well they pay attention? And this kind of tool tends to work better for some students than for other students, right? Just because of the way their head is shaped, let's say. Could be something as simple as that. Um, in that case, is this tool fair? The technical question is how can we make, and the technical discussion is how can we make the tool work equally well for every student? The ethics question is it important that it works equally well for every student? Or maybe a bit more nuanced question is probably yes, it's important, but what kind of range of error are we willing to accept? I mean, it will never work equally well exactly for every student. So where do we draw the line? At what point do minute differences between how well it works for one student and another student become differences in fairness? At what point does the tool become unfair? That's an ethics question. And again, it's completely different from the technical question about how we make the headset more fair. The ethics question is at what point do the differences in how well it works for one or another student become unfair? And we could go through and discuss more of these topics, but I think that's enough for our second point. What I'm trying to show with that example is how concretely ethics sounds. And what does it mean to talk the language of ethics? What it means to talk the language of ethics is to refer to human values, autonomy, privacy, fairness. And it means to evaluate, to ask questions. At what point do differences in performance become unfair for students? How much of the student's privacy is violated by these headsets? We said that these headsets take away some freedom, but they give other freedom. What is the end result? Ultimately, is freedom benefited or do we lose freedom because of these headsets? All that is ethics.